Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolded in Tulsa, Oklahoma, on a summer afternoon in 2011. This is a story about love that moved too quickly, about two young people who found themselves trapped in a relationship neither of them knew how to escape, and about a single moment that changed everything forever. So, as we settle in, let your breathing slow. This is the story of Joshua and Amber Hilberling, a tragedy that would captivate a nation and leave more questions than answers in its wake. Our story begins in early 2010 in Tulsa, a city that sits along the Arkansas River in northeastern Oklahoma. It was here that two young people met, each standing at the threshold of their adult lives, neither one knowing what the future would hold. Joshua Blaine Hilberling was born on May 30th, 1988. His parents, Patrick and Jen, raised him to be kind and thoughtful. Those who knew Josh described him as someone with an infectious smile, someone who put others before himself. He graduated from Victory Christian High School in 2007, where he played football and made friends easily. Josh had that quality that some people possess, the ability to light up a room simply by walking into it. After high school, Josh made the decision to serve his country. He enlisted in the United States Air Force, the choice his parents were proud of. The military represented structure, purpose, a path forward. For a young man from Oklahoma, it was a way to see the world, to become something greater than himself. Amber Michelle Fields was born 3 years later, on October 1st, 1991, in Joplin, Missouri. When she was just 3 months old, her family relocated to Tulsa. Amber grew up in a very different world than Josh. Her family was well known in the Tulsa area, affluent and successful. Her stepfather, Brian Whitlock, was a prominent plastic surgeon, and her mother, Rhonda, worked as a nurse. Amber had two siblings, a brother named Adam and a sister named Ariel. Throughout her school years, Amber excelled. She maintained a 4.0 grade point average, participated in soccer, volleyball, track, and dance. She was a talented writer who loved fashion, makeup, and shoes. Friends described her as smart, athletic, and beautiful. Everything seemed to come easily to her. In early 2010, when Amber was 18 and Josh was 22, their paths crossed. The details of how they met have been lost to time, but what we know is that something sparked between them immediately. Josh was drawn to Amber's intelligence and beauty. Amber was captivated by Josh's kindness and his military bearing. But there was a complication. Josh had enlisted in the Air Force, and he was scheduled to be stationed at Ealson Air Force Base in Fairbanks, Alaska, in just a few short months. For most young couples, this would mean a long-distance relationship or a painful goodbye, but Josh and Amber weren't interested in either of those options. There was only one way for Amber to accompany Josh to Alaska. They would have to be married. So after dating for just a few months, Josh proposed, and Amber said yes. It was a whirlwind romance, the kind that feels inevitable when you're young and in love. Neither of them stopped to consider whether they were moving too fast. Neither of them questioned whether they truly knew each other well enough to make such a profound commitment. They were married in 2010, and soon after they packed their belongings and headed north to Alaska to begin their life together in the frozen north, thousands of miles from family and everything they'd ever known. Fairbanks, Alaska is not an easy place to live. Located just 198 miles south of the Arctic Circle, it's a city where winter temperatures regularly drop to 40 below zero, where the sun barely rises during the darkest months, and where summer brings the opposite extreme, the midnight sun, days that stretch endlessly without darkness. For Amber, who had never lived anywhere but Oklahoma, the move was jarring. She had no friends in Alaska, no support system beyond Josh, and Josh, now fully immersed in his military duties, was often away or exhausted when he came home. Amber, who had been pampered and adored by her family, found herself alone in a small apartment in an unfamiliar place, waiting for a husband who seemed increasingly distant. Life in Alaska was difficult for both of them. The honeymoon period, which had barely existed to begin with, evaporated quickly. The strain of their hastily made decision began to show. They were in many ways still children themselves, playing at being adults, playing at being married, and then things became even more complicated. Amber discovered she was pregnant. The news should have been joyful, but instead it added another layer of stress to an already fragile situation. Amber felt more trapped than ever, pregnant and alone in Alaska. Josh felt the weight of impending fatherhood pressing down on him while he was trying to navigate the demands of military life. Their relationship began to fracture. Arguments became frequent. According to later accounts, both Josh and Amber could be physical with each other during fights. There are reports of a lamp being thrown, of injuries sustained, of police being called on more than one occasion. The details vary depending on who you ask. Josh's family would later claim that Amber was the aggressor, that their son was a victim of domestic abuse. Amber's family would insist the opposite was true, that Josh was violent and controlling, that Amber lived in fear. The truth, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere in between. They were two young people who had rushed into marriage without truly knowing each other, now trapped together in a place neither wanted to be, each one triggering the worst in the other. And then, after less than a year in Alaska, Josh's military career came to an abrupt end. The official records indicate he was discharged. The reasons given vary. Some sources suggest he was discharged for drug use. Whatever the cause, the end result was the same. Josh and Amber were no longer tied to Alaska. They could go home. In 2011, they returned to Tulsa. Perhaps they both hoped that being back in familiar territory, surrounded by family and friends, would help them fix what had broken between them. Perhaps they thought that going home would somehow make things right. They were wrong. The University Club Tower stands at 1722 South Carson Avenue in downtown Tulsa. It's a distinctive building, cylindrical in shape, rising 32 floors above the city. When it was built in 1966, it was designed to be elegant and modern, a prestigious address for Tulsa's elite. At 377 feet tall, it remains the tallest residential building in Oklahoma. By 2011, the building had aged. The windows, installed decades earlier, had weathered countless seasons. The glass had been recaulked multiple times. The rubber gaskets that held the panes in place had shrunk and been reused. But from the outside, the tower still looked imposing, still looked like a symbol of success. When Josh and Amber returned to Tulsa, they needed a place to live while their permanent home was being remodeled. Amber's mother and stepfather owned an apartment in the University Club Tower, and they offered it to the young couple. It was apartment number 2509, on the 25th floor, with sweeping views of the city and the Arkansas River below. Josh and Amber moved in with their infant son Levi, who had been born on August 7th, 2011, exactly 2 months after the tragedy that we're about to discuss. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In early June of 2011, Amber was 7 months pregnant. She and Josh had been living in the apartment for about 2 weeks. The walls were thin in the building, thin enough that neighbors could hear raised voices, the sounds of arguments that seemed to happen with increasing frequency. Their relationship had not improved since returning to Tulsa. If anything, it had deteriorated further. Both of them knew, on some level, that the marriage was failing. According to Amber's later testimony, she had told Josh on the morning of June 7th that she wanted a divorce. Josh's packed bags, found in the apartment after his death, suggested he had been planning to leave. Less than a month earlier, in May of 2011, Josh had visited domestic violence intervention services, seeking help. He had filed for an emergency protective order against Amber, claiming that she had thrown a lamp at his head, causing injuries that required staples and stitches. The protective order was dismissed 2 weeks later when neither of them appeared in court. Both families would later point to incidents of violence. Both sides would claim their loved one was the victim, the one who needed protection, and perhaps in their own ways. Both Josh and Amber felt victimized by a relationship that had spiraled beyond either of their control. June 7th. 2011, started like many other days. The tension between them was palpable. They had been arguing all morning, the kind of circular arguments that couples have when the relationship is ending, but neither person knows how to let go. At some point during the morning, Josh became angry and threw a laundry basket at a window in one of the smaller bedrooms. The window cracked. The damage needed to be repaired. Amber called the building's maintenance department, and they sent someone over. His name was Armando Rosales. He was a maintenance worker for the University Club Tower, and he arrived at apartment 2509 sometime in the early afternoon to assess the damage to the window in the bedroom. When Armando entered the apartment, he could immediately sense the tension. He would later testify that Josh seemed angry, while Amber appeared subdued, quiet. It was clear they had been fighting. The air in the apartment felt heavy with unspoken words, an unresolved conflict. Armando went to work examining the cracked window, while Josh and Amber retreated to the living room, where their argument continued. The living room featured large plate glass windows that looked out over the city. These windows stretched from just 26¼ inches above the floor all the way up to 6 feet, 5 inches high. For someone as tall as Josh, who stood at 6 feet 4 inches and weighed 220 pounds. The bottom sill of the window came up to about his knee. It was essentially a tripping hazard rather than a safety barrier. The glass in these windows was single strength, 0.092 inches thick, each pane. This type of glass is typically used in small windows and picture frames, not in high-rise buildings where wind loads and structural stress are significant factors. The windows had been installed in 1966, and over the decades, exposure to weather, temperature changes, and general wear had weakened them further. The caulking had decomposed. The gaskets were in poor condition. But Josh and Amber didn't know any of this. To them, the windows were just windows, a barrier between the living room and the outside world, unremarkable and seemingly solid. Armando was in the bedroom, working on the damaged window, when he heard the argument in the living room escalate. He heard raised voices, the sound of a yelling match between two people who had reached the end of their rope with each other, and then he heard something else. He heard what sounded like running footsteps moving rapidly from one side of the room to the other, from the direction of the door toward the windows. He heard a woman scream, "No, no, no." Then silence, then the sound of shattering glass, and then the same woman's voice again, louder now, hysterical. "Oh my God! Oh my God!" Armando dropped what he was doing and ran to the living room. The room was empty. One of the large plate glass windows was completely gone, nothing but a gaping hole where it had been. He rushed to the window and looked down. Far below, on the concrete roof of the 8th floor parking garage, he could see a body. The neighbor who lived in the apartment directly below, on the 24th floor, would later tell police that he had heard a noise above him, something that sounded like someone running across the floor toward the window. Then came the crash of breaking glass. 2 witnesses on the street below happened to be looking up at the building at that exact moment. They saw a man come out of the window on the 25th floor. He was face first, upright in the air. They watched as he fell 17 stories, a descent that took just 3 to 4 seconds, though it must have felt like an eternity. Joshua Blaine Hilberling died on impact. Amber's immediate reaction was to get to Josh. She ran out of the apartment and down to the elevator, pressing the button frantically, waiting for what must have felt like hours for the elevator to arrive. The apartment manager found her and tried to get her to calm down, concerned about the scene she was making. When Amber reached the parking garage and saw Josh's body on the concrete, she became hysterical. She screamed for someone to help him. She knelt beside him, kissing his face, begging him to be okay, even though it was clear to everyone there that he was gone. The first responders arrived quickly. Paramedics, police officers, firefighters, all converging on the scene. Officer Don Holloway was one of the first officers to arrive. He later said that his initial thought was suicide. It seemed like the most logical explanation. The young man had jumped from a high-rise building. Murder was, in his words, the furthest thing from his mind. Holloway approached Amber, who was still beside Josh's body, still crying and screaming. He gently pulled her away and suggested that she come with him down to the detective division of the Tulsa Police Department. She agreed, still in shock, still unable to process what had just happened. Throughout the ride to the police station, Amber kept asking Holloway if the paramedics were still working on Josh, if they had brought him back to life. She seemed unable to accept that he was gone, At the police station, Amber was placed in an interview room. The police allowed her grandmother to come in and sit with her to comfort her while they waited. The police weren't treating Amber as a suspect at this point. They still believed Josh's death was likely a suicide. But they had placed a camera in the room, recording everything. What happened next would become one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the case against Amber Hilberling. In the video, which would later be played for the jury at her trial, Amber can be seen talking to her grandmother. She's crying. Her face is red and swollen. Her voice is breaking. She's 7 months pregnant, overwhelmed with grief and shock. And then she says something that changes everything. "I'm a horrible person," she tells her grandmother. "Who could do that? Push my husband and make him fall. I want to be dead. I want Josh to be here. For the rest of my life, everyone's going to think I'm a murderer," she continues. Her words coming out in a rush. "They kept saying if we stayed together, I'm going to kill him. They were right." And then perhaps most damningly, she says, "Josh was messing with the TV, and I pushed him." The police, watching the video feed from another room, immediately realized what they were hearing. This wasn't a suicide. This was a homicide. And the person responsible had just confessed. Amber was arrested that same day and charged with second-degree murder. The charge was later upgraded to first-degree murder as prosecutors reviewed the evidence. Amber was released on bond the following day, but her life as she had known it was over. 2 months later, on August 7th, 2011, Amber gave birth to a baby boy. She and Josh had already chosen the name Levi. He would grow up without his father, and depending on how the trial went, he might grow up without his mother as well. The case didn't go to trial immediately. There were legal proceedings, motions, delays. Amber's attorneys worked to build her defense while prosecutors built their case against her. The media descended on Tulsa, fascinated by the story of a young, beautiful pregnant woman accused of murdering her husband. In March of 2013, nearly 2 years after Josh's death, the trial finally began. Amber was now 21 years old. Levi was 18 months old, being cared for by family members, while his mother's fate was decided. Before the trial started, prosecutors offered Amber a plea deal. If she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, she would serve 5 years in prison, plus 15 years of probation. Later, they offered an alternative, 7 years in prison with 13 years suspended. Amber's attorneys presented these offers to her. 5 years, and she would be out in time to watch Levi grow up, to be a mother to him. 7 years, still a chance at a life. But Amber refused. She would not plead guilty to intentionally killing Josh. She maintained that what had happened was an accident, that she had pushed him in self-defense, and never intended for him to go through the window. To plead guilty would be to lie, to admit to something she didn't believe she had done. So the case went to trial. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. They argued that Amber Hilberling had deliberately pushed her husband out of the window in a fit of rage during an argument. They presented evidence of the couple's volatile relationship, the history of domestic disputes, the protective order Josh had filed against Amber. They played the video of Amber talking to her grandmother, her words about pushing Josh, about being a horrible person. They called witnesses who had seen Josh fall from the window, who described him coming out face first and upright. They called the medic who had spoken to Amber at the scene, who testified that she had said she pushed Josh but didn't mean to kill him. They called police detectives who testified that when they examined the apartment, they saw no signs of a struggle, nothing to suggest that Josh had grabbed Amber or attacked her before he went through the window. And they called inmates who had been in jail with Amber, who claimed that Amber had told them she caught Josh off guard and pushed him because he was planning to leave her. The defense presented a very different narrative. Amber's attorneys argued that she had acted in self-defense, that Josh had grabbed her shoulders during the argument, making her fear for her unborn baby, and that she had pushed him away to protect herself and her child. What happened next, they argued, was a tragic accident caused by faulty windows. They called expert witnesses to testify about the windows in the University Club Tower. Mark Mishulam, a glass construction expert, examined the windows and concluded that they were too weak for their application. He testified that the single-strength glass, typically used only in small windows and picture frames, should never have been installed in a high-rise building. He explained that the glass had been weakened over decades of exposure to the elements, that the caulking was decomposing, that the gaskets were in poor condition, The defense also presented testimony about Josh's size compared to Amber's. Josh was 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 220 pounds. Amber was significantly smaller. How, the defense asked, could such a small woman have the strength to deliberately push such a large man through a window? Unless he was off balance. Unless he stumbled. Amber herself took the stand in her own defense. Speaking softly, sometimes crying, she told her version of what happened that day. She testified that she and Josh had been arguing all morning, that she had told him she wanted a divorce, that tensions were high between them. She said that when the maintenance man arrived to fix the broken window, she and Josh moved their argument to the living room. She described how Josh became frustrated and grabbed her shoulders. She was 7 months pregnant, she said, and in that moment she feared for her baby, so she pushed him off of her. She testified that she never intended for Josh to go through the window, that she didn't even know the window would break so easily. She described making eye contact with Josh as he fell, the look of surprise on his face, the horror of watching him disappear. She insisted, over and over, that she loved Josh, that she never wanted him to die, that what happened was an accident. But the prosecution had one powerful piece of evidence that was difficult to explain away. Amber's own words to her grandmother, captured on video just hours after Josh's death. Josh was messing with the TV, and I pushed him. In that statement, there was no mention of Josh grabbing her, no mention of self-defense, just a simple, devastating admission: she pushed him. The jury deliberated, weighing the evidence, trying to determine what had really happened in that apartment on June 7th, 2011. On March 18th, 2013, they reached their verdict. Guilty. Guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Josh's family wept with relief. Amber's family wept with despair. Amber herself seemed to crumble, the reality of what was happening finally sinking in. During sentencing, prosecutors filed a memorandum noting that although Amber had no prior criminal record, she had been certainly on notice that she and Josh had a volatile relationship, and that she became angry and acted out violently toward Joshua. Amber's attorneys asked for leniency, pointing out that Josh and Amber were really just children themselves when they brought Levi into the world. They noted that Levi would be in his 20s by the time his mother was released, if she served a full sentence. But the judge was unmoved. On April 15th, 2013, Amber Hilberling was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the 85% rule in Oklahoma, which requires certain offenders to serve 85% of their sentence. Amber would need to serve just over 21 years before becoming eligible for parole. Levi was 18 months old. By the time Amber could get out of prison, he would be in his 20s. She would miss his entire childhood. Amber was transferred to Mabel Bassett Correctional Center in McLeod, Oklahoma, a women's prison where she would begin serving her sentence. But the story doesn't end there. In the years following her conviction, Amber Hilberling became something of a media sensation. Her case was featured on Dateline NBC in May of 2013, in an hour-long episode that explored both sides of the story. The show interviewed Amber, her family, Josh's family, attorneys, police investigators, and the window expert who had testified at trial.
In the Dateline interview, Amber maintained her innocence. She said she was a good wife, that she wasn't a violent person, that during her marriage she was definitely scared sometimes. She insisted that Josh's death was an accident, that she never intended to kill him.
Josh's family appeared on the same program, sharing their grief and their belief that justice had been served. They painted a picture of Josh as a victim of domestic abuse, a kind young man who had been trapped in a relationship with a violent, unstable woman. Amber's family countered with their own narrative, insisting that Josh had been the abusive one, that Amber had pushed him in legitimate self-defense, and that she was being wrongly punished for an accident. The two families, both grieving and both convinced of their own version of the truth, couldn't have been more divided. In February of 2016, Amber appeared on the Dr. Phil show from prison. In that interview, she provided more details about the argument that led to Josh's death. She told Dr. Phil that during the argument, Josh had reached out and grabbed her, and she remembered thinking about the baby she was carrying. "And I was pregnant," she said, "and he didn't care." She described pushing him off of her and then said, "The window wasn't supposed to happen." That phrase, "the window wasn't supposed to happen," encapsulated the tragedy of the entire case. In a different building, With different windows, Josh would have stumbled backward into solid glass. He might have fallen to the floor. They would have kept arguing. Or maybe they would have stopped, shaken by how close they had come to something terrible. But the window wasn't supposed to break. And yet it did. Throughout her time in prison, Amber continued to maintain her innocence. She filed an appeal, arguing that she had been wrongly convicted, that the jury should have taken the faulty windows into account, that her actions constituted self-defense rather than murder. The appeal was denied. Amber turned 25 years old in prison on October 1st, 2016. She had been incarcerated for more than 3 years by this point. Levi was 5 years old living with family members, growing up without either of his parents. And then on October 24th, 2016, prison officials at Mabel Bassett Correctional Center found Amber Helberling dead in her cell. The official cause of death was ruled suicide by hanging. Amber was 25 years old. Her family was devastated. Her mother, Rhonda, immediately questioned the official ruling. She didn't believe her daughter had taken her own life. She suspected something darker, something more sinister. In interviews, she suggested that Amber might have been murdered in prison, though she offered no evidence to support this theory. The family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Oklahoma Department of Corrections, alleging that the prison had failed to protect Amber from harm. The lawsuit claimed that on the day of Amber's death, several security failures had put her life at risk, including inoperable surveillance equipment and inadequate security checks. It also alleged that in the months leading up to her death, Amber had not been consistently receiving the psychotropic medication she had been prescribed, and that she had not been protected from other prisoners with well-known predator tendencies. The lawsuit painted a picture of a prison system that was overcrowded, underfunded, and unable to adequately care for its inmates. Mabel Bassett Correctional Center, built to hold 1,280 women, was housing 1,292 at the time of Amber's death. The facility was operating at 115% capacity. Oklahoma, the lawsuit noted, has the highest incarceration rate in the country for both men and women. The state's punitive sentencing policies, including the 85% rule, mean that people serve extraordinarily long sentences compared to other states. And women, particularly women convicted of nonviolent crimes or crimes related to domestic situations, bear the brunt of this system. In 2019, the wrongful death lawsuit was dropped. The family never got the answers they were seeking about what happened to Amber in those final hours. On social media, the debate continued. Facebook pages dedicated to supporting Amber argued that she had been wrongly convicted, that she was a victim of domestic violence who acted in self-defense, and that she should never have been in prison in the first place. Other pages dedicated to Joshua's memory maintained that justice had been served, that Amber was a murderer who got what she deserved. Even in death, Amber couldn't escape the controversy that had defined her life since June 7th, 2011. Josh's parents, Patrick and Jan Helberling, grieved the loss of their son and the grandson they would never get to raise. They believed that Josh had been a victim, that Amber had taken him from them in a moment of rage. Amber's parents, Rhonda and Brian Whitlock, grieved the loss of their daughter and the years she would never get to spend with Levi. They believed that Amber had been a victim, that the justice system had failed her, and that she had paid the ultimate price for an accident. And Levi, caught in the middle of it all, lost both of his parents before he was old enough to remember either of them clearly. So what really happened on June 7th, 2011, in apartment 2509 of the University Club Tower? The truth is, we'll never know for certain. Only 2 people were in that room when Josh Hilberling went through the window, and both of them are dead now. What we do know is that Josh and Amber Hilberling were 2 young people who rushed into a marriage neither of them was prepared for. They were barely more than children themselves when they decided to build a life together, to start a family, to navigate the complexities of adult relationships. We know that their relationship was volatile, that both of them could be physically aggressive, that there were incidents of violence on both sides. Whether Josh was the primary aggressor or whether Amber was, or whether they were equally responsible for the toxicity between them, depends entirely on whose family you ask. We know that on that afternoon in June, an argument escalated in a way that neither of them could have predicted. We know that Amber pushed Josh, and that Josh fell backward, and that the window, weakened by decades of exposure to the elements, shattered under the impact of his body. We know that Josh fell 17 stories and died instantly, leaving behind a pregnant wife and a family that would never recover from the loss. We know that Amber was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison, and that she maintained her innocence until the day she died. We know that 4 years into her sentence, Amber was found dead in her cell, and that her death was ruled a suicide, though her family never accepted that conclusion. And we know that Levi Hilberling, who never got the chance to know his parents, was left to grow up with the weight of this tragedy hanging over him, a living reminder of a love story that ended in the worst possible way. The case of Joshua and Amber Hilberling raises difficult questions. Questions about domestic violence, about who gets believed and who doesn't. Questions about the criminal justice system, about whether a 25-year sentence was appropriate for what might have been a tragic accident. Questions about prison conditions and whether Amber received adequate care and protection during her incarceration. Questions about mental health, about two people who clearly needed help but never got it in time. There are no easy answers. There are only the facts of what happened, and the two very different narratives that emerged from those facts. Josh's family believes their son was murdered by a woman who couldn't control her temper. They believe justice was served when Amber was convicted, and they continue to honor Josh's memory as a kind, gentle soul who deserved a long life. Amber's family believes their daughter was wrongfully convicted for defending herself in an abusive relationship. They believe the faulty windows were to blame, that what happened was an accident, and that Amber should never have spent a single day in prison. Both families love their children. Both families have suffered unimaginable loss. And somewhere in Oklahoma, a boy named Levi is growing up, trying to make sense of a tragedy that began before he was even born. And so, we come to the end of this story. The story of Joshua and Amber Hilberling is one without a clear resolution, without a satisfying conclusion. It's a story that reminds us that real life is messy and complicated, that people are not simply good or evil, victims or villains. It's a reminder that decisions made in haste can have consequences that last a lifetime. That love, without trust and communication and maturity, can become something dangerous. That a single moment, a single push, can change everything forever. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Let me share with you a story. It's a story about a young woman whose light touched many lives, and whose disappearance became a mystery that would take over a decade to solve. This is a journey through the quiet suburbs of Ohio, through the determination of a father who never gave up, and through the patient work of investigators who refused to let a case go cold. This is the story of Caitlin Markham. In the summer of 2011, in the town of Fairfield, Ohio, there lived a young woman named Caitlin Markham. She was just days away from turning 22, standing on the precipice of everything life had to offer. Those who knew her described her in words that painted a picture of warmth and creativity. She was eccentric, they said, colorful, a light that helped others come out of their shells, much like a butterfly emerging from its cocoon. Caitlin had a paintbrush tucked into her hair more often than not, always searching for her next creative project. Art wasn't just something she did, it was who she was. She studied graphic arts at the Art Institute of Ohio in Cincinnati, pouring her passion into every assignment, every sketch, every design. Her professors noticed her dedication. Her classmates admired her talent. She was weeks away from completing her degree, ready to step into the world as a professional artist. But Caitlin wasn't just an artist. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. Her father, Dave Markham, described her as warm, outgoing, positive, and energetic, reliable, responsive, the kind of person who showed up when she said she would, who worked hard at her 2 jobs, who balanced school and work and still found time for the people she loved. Her younger sister, Allie, was just starting high school that summer. She looked up to Caitlin with the kind of admiration only a younger sibling can have. Caitlin always took care of her, always made time for her, even with her busy schedule. She worked at David's Bridal near Tri-County Mall, helping other young women prepare for the most important day of their lives. She also had an internship at her school's bookstore, gaining experience in the professional world she was about to enter. Caitlin had been with her boyfriend, John Carter, for about 6 years. They had recently become engaged, and their future seemed mapped out before them. They talked about moving to Colorado after Caitlin graduated, starting fresh in a new place where John, who shared Caitlin's artistic inclinations and worked as a glassblowing instructor, could pursue his own dreams. To the outside world, they seemed like two creative souls building a life together. But as summer wound down in 2011, there were small cracks beginning to show, cracks that few people could see. August 13th, 2011, was a Saturday. The weekend air in Fairfield carried the sounds of the annual Sacred Heart Festival. The clanking of carnival rides echoed through the neighborhood. The scent of corn dogs and cotton candy drifted on the warm breeze. Families gathered, children ran between game booths, and for most people in Fairfield, it was just another carefree summer weekend. For Caitlin, it had been a long day. She had worked her shift at David's Bridal, spending hours on her feet helping customers. She returned home to her townhouse on Dorshire Drive, tired but looking forward to relaxing. The townhouse was her own space, a place where she lived independently with her dog, a faithful companion who greeted her at the door. That evening, John Carter came over. According to what he would later tell police, a friend of Caitlin's also stopped by to visit. But this friend sensed something in the air, tension, the kind of unspoken discomfort that makes a room feel smaller. Caitlin seemed quiet, subdued. The friend decided to leave early, giving the couple space. John told investigators that Caitlin's quietness was because they had taken magic mushrooms together. But this detail raised questions later. Caitlin had just returned from a long shift at work, arriving home only about 15 minutes before her friend came over. Mushrooms take time to affect someone. Would she really have taken them when she was tired and just wanted to unwind? Some who knew her found this hard to believe. There were other things that had been happening beneath the surface. Friends later shared that Caitlin had confided she was tired of their relationship. She was reconsidering the move to Colorado. The future she and John had planned was beginning to feel less certain to her. One of John's friends would later make a revealing statement to investigators. If Caitlin were to break up with John, it would be catastrophic for him. The night unfolded in the way John Carter described to police. Around 11 o'clock, he said he left Caitlin's townhouse to meet friends at a bonfire. He brought with him a bag of documents belonging to Caitlin. Papers she wanted destroyed. She didn't have a shredder, so John offered to burn them in the fire. To some, this seemed like a thoughtful gesture. To others, looking back, it seemed unusual. Why those particular documents? Why that night? John said he arrived at his friend's house and stayed there for a while, joining the gathering around the fire. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, he drove to his mother's house, where he lived. He watched one of his favorite shows, he said, and fell asleep around 4 in the morning. His computer activity would later be examined, creating timestamps of his movements that night. Meanwhile, Caitlin's neighbor, a woman whose apartment shared a wall with Caitlin's, was home that night. Later, she would tell investigators about something she heard. It was sometime that evening on August 13th. Through the wall, she heard a woman's voice shout, "Stop it." Then came a thump. After that, silence. She didn't think much of it at the time. Young couples argue. Things happen. But that moment would become significant later. Caitlin's cell phone sent its last communication just before 1 o'clock in the morning. On August 14th, it was a photo sent to John's phone at 12:52 a.m. The phone's GPS turned off. The phone itself went dark at 12:45 a.m. Whatever had happened, it happened in those quiet hours when most of Fairfield was sleeping, when the festival had closed down for the night, when the streets were empty. Sunday, August 14th, 2011, began like any other summer morning, but by evening something was wrong. John Carter made a phone call at 7:59 p.m. The dispatcher answered, and John's voice came through the line. Fast, nervous, apologetic for calling before the usual 24-hour missing person window. His fiancée was missing, he said. He couldn't find her anywhere. He had last seen her around midnight, and now she wasn't responding to his messages. Her car was still at her townhouse. Everything seemed to be in place, but Caitlin was gone. Officer Sandy Sears was working patrol that evening. She was the first to arrive at Caitlin's townhouse on Dorshire Drive, and years later she would speak publicly for the first time about what she observed that night. She hadn't even gotten out of her patrol car when John Carter was at her driver's side door. He started speaking rapidly, a torrent of information pouring out of him. To Officer Sears it seemed rehearsed, as if he had practiced what he was going to say and was trying to get it all out before he forgot. She examined the scene carefully. There was no forced entry, no signs of a struggle, no broken windows or damaged locks. Caitlin's wallet was there, her keys were there, her ID, her purse, all her belongings exactly where they should be. Only her cell phone was missing. After speaking with her sergeant and assessing the situation, Officer Sears came to a grim conclusion. She didn't think Caitlin was coming home alive, but still, there was hope. There had to be. Dave Markham, Caitlin's father, received a call that his daughter was missing. He didn't know what to think, but something didn't feel right. Within hours, the case was being treated seriously. Flyers went up. Volunteers gathered. The community rallied. John Carter became the public face of the search. He spoke to local media, then national media. He appeared on CNN's Nancy Grace show, not once but twice that month. "Caitlin is the love of my life," he told reporters, his voice heavy with emotion. "We've been engaged for a year." He said he was calling her cell phone every day, hoping she would answer, hoping she would come home. Dave Markham stood beside him at vigils, united in their grief. Ally, just beginning her high school years, watched her world turn upside down. In the days following Caitlin's disappearance, the community began to understand that she was more than just a face on a missing person poster. She was a bright light that had been extinguished too soon. The search for Caitlin Markham became one of the most extensive missing person searches Fairfield had ever seen. News of her disappearance traveled beyond Ohio, reaching Texas, where Tim Miller, founder of Texas EquuSearch, heard about the case. Miller's organization specializes in finding missing persons. And on September 1st, 2011, they arrived in Ohio to help. Finding Caitlin would be a challenge. Miller knew there was no evidence of foul play, but there was also no indication she had left on her own. Volunteers tore through heavily wooded areas. They scoured creeks and trekked along abandoned train tracks. They searched abandoned buildings and fields. Hot summer days turned into chilly fall nights, and still the searches continued. The reward for information grew. It started at $25,000, offered by Cincinnati restaurateur Jeff Ruby. By February 2012, he doubled it to $50,000. Eventually it would grow to $100,000, funded by anonymous donors and community members who refused to let Caitlin be forgotten. Investigators worked every angle. They looked at people who knew Caitlin. They investigated a man named Gurpreet Kang, who had lived across from Caitlin and worked at a gas station near her residence. He was later charged with an unrelated assault case, but police cleared him of any involvement in Caitlin's disappearance. As months passed without answers, the case began to fade from the daily headlines. Dave Markham refused to give up. He knew in his heart what had happened to his daughter, even though he desperately hoped he was wrong. He participated in searches for other missing people, understanding the torture of not knowing, of hoping against hope for a miracle that might never come. On April 7th, 2013, nearly 20 months after Caitlin disappeared, a couple was searching for scrap metal in a remote wooded area in Cedar Grove, Indiana. It was an illegal dump site, a place where people discarded things they didn't want anyone to find. About 20 miles west of Fairfield, hidden in the trees near a creek bed, they found something that made them stop. Bones. Human bone. Indiana State Police were called. The area was secured. The remains were carefully collected and transported to the Hamilton County Coroner's Office. Dental records were used to make the identification. And on that day, Dave Markham's worst fears were confirmed. The remains were Caitlin's. His daughter had been found. But finding her body only raised more questions. How did she end up in Indiana? How did she die? The coroner, Wanda Lee of Franklin County, Indiana, ruled Caitlin's death a homicide on August 13th, 2013, exactly 2 years after she disappeared. but the cause of death could not be determined. Her remains had been exposed to the elements for too long. Whatever had happened to her, the physical evidence had been lost to time and nature. The location was significant. The wooded area in Cedar Grove was not far from a farm owned by the Carter family. It was a remote place, the kind of location someone would choose if they didn't want something to be found. During the earlier searches, Texas IQ had come within about 10 miles of where Caitlin's remains were ultimately discovered. They had so much area to cover, so many leads to follow. In the vastness of rural Indiana, finding one person was like finding a needle in a haystack. In April 2014, a tip came in. Police returned to the same location in Cedar Grove, and additional remains belonging to Caitlin were found. The investigation continued, but there were no arrests, no charges. The case remained unsolved. Dave Markham held a funeral for his daughter at Fairfield High School Auditorium on August 25, 2013. Friends and family gathered to celebrate her life, to mourn her loss, to remember the vibrant young woman who had so much left to give. But for Dave, it wasn't closure. It was just another chapter in a nightmare that wouldn't end. The years passed slowly. 2014 became 2015. In 2015, at Dave Markham's urging, the Butler County Sheriff's Office took over the investigation from Fairfield Police. Fresh eyes examined the evidence. Detectives Rob Whitlock and Brian Nerlinger dove into the case file, reviewing everything that had been collected since that August night in 2011. In August 2016, 5 years after Caitlin's disappearance, a documentary premiered at a theater in Springdale, Ohio. It was called Taken Too Soon: The Caitlin Markham Story. Dave Markham hoped it would generate new leads, bring fresh information to light, keep his daughter's case in the public consciousness. The one-hour film chronicled the investigation and the family's pain. In 2016, sheriff's investigators announced they believed they knew who killed Caitlin. They had narrowed it down to a strong person of interest. Sergeant Rob Whitlock told the media. But they wouldn't name the person. They didn't have enough evidence yet. The circumstantial case they were building needed more. 2018 brought an unexpected development. Another young woman's body was found in a field in Liberty Township. Her name was Ellie Wyke, and she was 23 years old. She had lived near where Caitlin was reported missing, and the two women looked strikingly alike. A man named Michael Strauss was quickly arrested and convicted in Ellie's murder. Strauss had been stalking her. Investigators looked at possible connections to Caitlin's case, because Strauss was an old acquaintance of John Carter, but no direct link was ever established. In 2020, the Butler County Prosecutor's Office took on the case. Prosecutor Michael Jamoser assigned lead investigator Paul Newton and assistant prosecutor Brad Burris to examine everything once more. They created what they called a war room. The walls were plastered with photographs of everyone who had been in Caitlin's life. Timeline charts tracked movements and phone calls. Evidence was cataloged and re-examined. Newton interviewed more than 120 people over the next few years. He analyzed every piece of evidence collected since 2011. The material Caitlin's body had been wrapped in, the location where she was found, the phone records and computer data, the witness statements and polygraph results. 63 different individuals underwent interviews or polygraph examinations. 20 people of interest were systematically eliminated through alibis or polygraphs. The investigation was painstaking, methodical, exhaustive. Detectives Whitlock and Nerlinger later said they were 100% confident in their conclusion about who was responsible, confident enough to put their names and careers on the lean, but proving it was another matter entirely. In September 2022, Michael G. Moser confirmed publicly that his office was actively investigating the Caitlin Markham case. He told reporters he was holding his cards close to the vest. Behind the scenes, the investigation was reaching its climax. On February 17, 2023, the first arrest was made. Jonathan Palmerton, who had been friends with John Carter, was taken into custody at his workplace, a Fairfield restaurant. He was charged with perjury, accused of lying during the investigation, possibly to a grand jury. The specific details of his alleged lies were not made public, but his arrest signaled that something significant was happening. 3 weeks later, on March 22, 2023, John Carter was arrested at his workplace. A grand jury had indicted him on March 13th. The indictment was unsealed 10 days later, and the charges were shocking. 2 counts of murder in the death of Caitlin Markham, nearly 12 years after she disappeared, nearly 10 years after her remains were found. An arrest had finally been made. John Carter, now 35 years old, married and a father, was taken into custody. He was arraigned on March 27th in Butler County Common Pleas Court. His defense attorney entered a plea of not guilty on his behalf. A $1 million bond was set, with the stipulation that Carter would be monitored by GPS if he posted it. During the bond hearing, prosecutor G. Mazur revealed new details. There was evidence of trauma to Caitlin's body, he said. Evidence that her body may have been moved. And then he shared something that sent chills through the courtroom. Investigators had found poems in John Carter's journal. They had been hidden in a drawer in his mother's house, where he lived in 2011. Carter's name was handwritten at the top of the pages. The words were disturbing, a window into thoughts that contradicted everything he had said publicly for over a decade. One poem read, "Deep down I love her. You want to kill her. But I love her. She must die." Another wrote, "I know I'll bury the body in the backyard. No, I'll bury it under the trailer, and wait until the grass grows over it and leave before anyone reports it missing." These were not the words of a grieving fiancé, desperately searching for his lost love. These were the words of someone with dark, violent thoughts, whether they were written before or after Caitlin's disappearance. They painted a picture that prosecutors believed showed consciousness of guilt. Dave Markham and his daughter Allie sat in the front row of the courtroom during the arraignment. Supporters wore butterflies in remembrance of Caitlin, the free-spirited art student whose symbol had become the butterfly, representing the way she helped others come out of their shells. Carter posted the $1 million bond on April 3rd, 2023. He was released with GPS monitoring, allowed to go home while he awaited trial. As the case moved toward trial, search warrants were unsealed, revealing the circumstantial case prosecutors had built. It was a mosaic of small pieces, each one adding to a larger picture. There were the phone records showing the timeline of that night. Caitlin's cell phone going dark at 12:45 a.m. The photo text sent at 12:52 a.m., after the phone had already been turned off, suggesting someone else sent it. John's computer activity that established when he was at his mother's house, work records and Facebook messages, and Google searches. There were the witness statements. The neighbor who heard "stop it," followed by a thump. The friend who sensed tension between Caitlin and John that final evening. The people in John's inner circle who said Caitlin had been reconsidering their relationship, that she was tired of it, that she was thinking about not moving to Colorado after all. The statement from John's friend that breaking up would be catastrophic for him. There was physical evidence too, though not the kind that provides absolute certainty. The material Caitlin's body had been found wrapped in. The location of the dump site near property owned by the Carter family. The fact that there was no forced entry into Caitlin's townhouse suggesting she knew her attacker. The absence of her engagement ring, which was never found. Investigators had spoken to 2 teenagers who claimed they saw something strange at Carter's house in the early morning hours of August 14th, 2011. They said they had sneaked out to go to a party, and around 2 o'clock in the morning they saw 2 cars pull up to Carter's home with their lights off. One was Carter's red Ford. About 5 minutes later, they said, Carter's car emerged from the garage, and both cars drove away. The original lead detective on the case found their accounts questionable, partly because Carter's computer activity seemed to contradict their story, but it remained part of the evidence file. There were items on the evidence list that hinted at the investigation's scope. 13 written statements, 63 interviews and polygraphs, tips from the public, an anthropology report, a forensic entomology investigation report, analyzing insects found on the remains to help determine time of death, reports from multiple police agencies, news media coverage, jail calls made by Carter after his arrest, and both Caitlin's and Carter's laptops and cell phones. There was also a letter Caitlin had written to her father, and an email she had sent to Carter on August 13th, 2011, the day she disappeared. The contents of these communications were not made fully public, but they were part of the story investigators had pieced together. One of the more unusual pieces of evidence was photographs related to Michael Strauss, the man convicted of killing Ellie Wake, though no direct connection was ever proven. Investigators had explored every possibility. following every thread that might lead to answers. But despite all of this, there was one crucial thing missing. Prosecutors could not definitively say how Catelyn died. The cause of death remained undetermined. There was no murder weapon, no forensic evidence like DNA or fingerprints that directly placed Carter at the scene of Catelyn's death. Everything was circumstantial. As prosecutor G. Moser acknowledged, many cases are built on circumstantial evidence. Defendants are convicted without bodies being found, without murder weapons, without eyewitnesses. The law recognizes that juries can find guilt beyond a reasonable doubt based on the totality of circumstances. But it also meant that taking this case to trial was a risk. June 7th, 2024. John Carter's trial was scheduled to begin in just over 2 weeks. For Dave Markham, it was the moment he had waited 13 years for. The chance to hear evidence presented in court. The chance for a jury to decide whether John Carter had killed his daughter. But then something unexpected happened. Carter's defense team approached prosecutors with a proposal. They wanted to make a deal. After more than a decade of denying any involvement in Catelyn's death, after maintaining his innocence through countless interviews, after posting bond and preparing for trial, John Carter was willing to admit guilt, but not to murder. The plea deal offered was this. Carter would plead guilty to involuntary manslaughter, a third-degree felony. In exchange, the 2 murder charges would be dropped. Involuntary manslaughter, under Ohio law, meant that Catelyn had died during the commission of a misdemeanor assault. The maximum sentence allowed for involuntary manslaughter was 3 years in prison. 3 years for a life taken. Prosecutor Jim Moser faced an impossible choice. Take the case to trial with circumstantial evidence and risk a not guilty verdict, or accept the plea and guarantee that Carter would admit responsibility and serve time, even if it seemed insufficient. There was also the consideration that a single holdout juror could result in a hung jury, forcing a retrial or potentially allowing Carter to walk free. Dave Markham learned of the plea deal before it was finalized. In an interview with Dateline, he described the moment as painful and shocking. But he understood the risk. There was a chance John could walk free if the jury didn't convict. And Dave didn't want that. As much as 3 years seemed inadequate, it was better than nothing. It was an admission of guilt. It was justice of a sort, even if it felt incomplete. On June 7th, 2024, John Carter stood before Judge Dan Hagee in a Butler County courtroom. When asked for his plea to involuntary manslaughter, Carter admitted his guilt after 13 years, after hundreds of interviews, after a massive investigation involving multiple agencies and countless hours of work. John Carter finally said the words Dave Markham needed to hear. He was responsible for Catelyn's death, but the details of how she died remained unknown. Carter's defense attorney declined to comment when asked how Catelyn was killed. The only detail revealed in court was that she died during a misdemeanor assault. What that assault entailed, what happened in those final moments, would never be fully explained. Sentencing was set for July 18th, 2024. The sentencing hearing took place on a summer day, 13 years and 10 months after Catelyn Markham disappeared. Dave Markham stood before the court, his voice steady but laden with years of grief, and read a letter he had written. Not a day goes by that I don't think of Catelyn, he told Judge Hagee. He spoke of the pain he had endured for the past 13 years. The pain that Allie had endured, that Catelyn's friends and the entire community had endured. He asked the judge to impose the maximum sentence allowed by law. Let him feel the pain that many of us have endured, he said. He also spoke of what had been stolen from them. He often wondered what Catelyn would be doing with her art and her career. He said he thought she would have been an amazing woman. That future had been taken from her. From all of them. John Carter did not speak during the sentencing hearing. He sat silently as the proceedings unfolded. His attorneys asked Judge Hagee to impose probation or a minimal prison term, arguing that the court should consider the law and not emotional statements. They painted a picture of a man who had cooperated with the plea deal, who had finally admitted responsibility after years of denial. But Judge Hagee was unmoved. He noted that Carter had shown no genuine remorse for the offense. He pointed out that Carter did not try to help Catelyn after her death, did not acknowledge what happened to her immediately, did not give her family the answers they deserved in the years that followed. The judge imposed the maximum term allowed under the plea agreement, 3 years in prison. It was both a victory and a crushing disappointment. Carter was led away in handcuffs, no longer free on bond. He would serve his sentence, with an expected release date of July 4th, 2027. 3 years for a life that should have spanned decades. 3 years for a young woman who never got to finish her degree, never got to build her career, never got to become the amazing woman her father knew she would have been. Dave Markham spoke to the media after the sentencing. He said Carter was responsible and deserved what he got. He admitted feeling relieved and grateful that the judge had given the maximum sentence possible. But he also acknowledged a hard truth. It's not over, and no, it's not closure. But it's the start of something else to come. The perjury charges against Jonathan Palmerton had been dismissed in May 2023, though prosecutor Domzer indicated he might pursue new charges against him in the future. The 5-year statute of limitations was still in effect, giving prosecutors time to decide. Investigators Rob Whitlock and Brian Nerlinger attended the sentencing. Whitlock told reporters afterward that Carter had said in front of Dave Markham, "I killed your daughter." It was a moment 13 years in the making. An admission that validated the years of investigation, the hundreds of hours of interviews, the determination of everyone who refused to let this case go cold. In September 2024, Dateline NBC devoted a 2-hour episode to Caitlin Markham's case. They called it The Butterfly. Andrea Canning, the correspondent who reported the story, interviewed Dave Markham, Allie Markham, investigator Paul Newton, and others who had been part of Caitlin's life and the investigation into her death. Canning described the case as challenging to cover because of the long time frame, the many people involved, the multiple agencies that had worked on it over the years, and the controversial ending. An involuntary manslaughter plea for what had been charged as murder was not the resolution many had hoped for. But Canning also spoke about what viewers should take away from the story. The immense love of a parent and the lengths they will go to not give up on finding their child. Dave Markham had been relentless. He had advocated for his daughter's case through media interview. He had pushed for new agencies to take over when he felt progress had stalled. He had attended every court hearing. He had participated in searches for other missing people, knowing their family's pain because he had lived it himself. Allie Markham, who was just starting high school when her sister vanished, spoke about how it changed the course of her life. The grief and pain were still with her every day. She had lost not just her sister, but the future they should have shared together. The butterfly became Caitlin's symbol for a reason. Those who knew her said she helped others come out of their shells, gave them confidence, brought light into their lives. She was colorful, eccentric, full of enthusiasm and dreams and hopes. The butterfly represented transformation, beauty, freedom. All the things Caitlin embodied and all the things that were taken from her. In the years since Caitlin's death, other families have faced similar nightmares. Dave Markham mentioned Debbie Estes, whose son Billy DeSilvestro went missing from Hamilton in 2011, the same year Caitlin disappeared. He thought of Chelsea Johnson, just 15 years old, found dead in a creek bed a mile from where Caitlin lived. And Joseph Oakley, 19, found dead near the same location. He thought of Ellie White, whose case had so many strange parallels to Caitlin's. These stories connect to each other in ways that are both tragic and profoundly human. Each victim represents a family's worst nightmare. Each case represents investigators working tirelessly to find answers. And each outcome, whether resolved or still open, represents a life that mattered, a person who was loved in a community that refuses to forget. Caitlin Markham's remains were laid to rest, but her memory lives on in the butterfly pins worn by supporters, in the documentary that bears her name, in the Dateline episode that shares her story with millions, in the heart of a father who will never stop missing his daughter, in the memories of a sister who lost her best friend, in the work of investigators who spent years seeking justice. The case is officially closed now. John Carter admitted to causing Caitlin's death. He is serving his sentence. But for Dave Markham, as he said, it's not closure. How can it be when so many questions remain unanswered? How did Caitlin die? What exactly happened in those final moments? Why did it take 13 years for Carter to admit the truth? Some questions may never have answers. Some wounds may never fully heal. But there is something in the way Dave Markham continues to fight, continues to remember, continues to honor his daughter's memory, that speaks to the resilience of the human spirit. There is something in the way Allie Markham keeps her sister's memory alive that shows the enduring power of love. And there is something in the fact that Caitlin's story is still being told, still being remembered, that ensures she will never truly be forgotten. And so we come to the end of this story. A story of a bright young woman whose life was cut tragically short. A story of a father's unwavering determination to find justice for his daughter. A story of investigators who refused to give up, even when years passed with no arrests. A story of a community that rallied together to search for one of their own. Caitlin Markham was 21 years old when she disappeared. She would be 34 now if she were still here. We can only imagine the art she would have created, the lives she would have touched, the light she would have continued to shine into the world. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll think of Caitlin. Perhaps you'll remember that every person has a story. Every life has value, and every family who loses someone deserves answers. Perhaps you'll remember the butterfly, and what it represents about transformation and beauty and the fragile nature of life itself. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight we're traveling to the snow-covered hills of Ontario, Canada, where a picture-perfect life concealed something far darker beneath its surface. This is a story about trust, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of secrets kept too long. Our story takes place in Collingwood, Ontario, a charming town nestled in the Blue Mountains, known for its ski slopes and tight-knit community. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where families gather for winter sports and summer hikes. It's a town where tragedy feels impossible, and yet on a cold January morning in 2023, that sense of safety would be shattered forever. Ashley Jane Milnes grew up in the comfortable suburban streets of North Toronto, in a neighborhood called Hoggs Hollow, born around 1983 to Ian and Shelley Milnes. Ashley was the youngest daughter in a family of 4 children. She had 2 older sisters, Leslie Ann and Lindsay Patricia, and a younger brother, Ian David. Her family was warm, loving, and close. They called her by affectionate nicknames, Boo Boo, Boob, or simply AJ. The Milnes family had a tradition. Every winter, they would escape to their chalet in Collingwood, where the snow fell thick and pristine, blanketing the ski hills in whites. Ashley loved those trips. She loved the crisp air, the thrill of skiing down the slopes, the warmth of gathering with family by the fireplace afterward. It was in this world of winter sports and mountain retreats that Ashley would eventually meet the man she thought would be her forever. But before that, Ashley built a life of her own. She attended Dalhousie University and then launched herself into the working world with determination and ambition. Her career path took her through several companies. In 2006, she worked as a personal assistant at Bosley Real Estate. Later in 2011, she owned a business called Stage of Art. By 2014, she was a designer and office manager at Porter Skelton and Associates. Ashley was known for her warmth. Friends and colleagues would later describe her as someone who made everyone feel like the most special person in the world. She had a gift for listening, for making people feel seen and heard. She was free-spirited and energetic, the kind of person who could brighten a dull room just by walking into it. By 2021, Ashley had become a construction project coordinator for Patty Mac. And then in 2022, she took on a role as a project specialist at Blake Farrow Project Management. She was good at what she did. She was organized, detail-oriented, someone who could manage complex projects while still making time for the people she loved. Through it all, Ashley remained deeply connected to her family, even after her mother, Shelley, passed away from cancer in September of 2004. At the age of 55, Ashley held the family together. She became the sounding board for her siblings, cousins, and friends. She was the glue, the one people turned to when they needed support. James William Schwalm came from a very different world, though on the surface it might have seemed similar. Born into a family of philanthropists and good Samaritans, James grew up with privilege and opportunity. His maternal grandparents were devout Christians who ran a foundation that funded educational programs. hospice care, and addiction recovery treatment. His mother, Diane, was an executive in the entertainment industry who sat on prestigious boards, including the Jays Care Foundation, the Toronto Santa Claus Parade, and the Canadian Tourette Syndrome Foundation. In 1998, she even co-created Canada's Walk of Fame. James and his two younger sisters spent their childhood wintering at the family's chalet near Collingwood. Like Ashley, James was a member of the Craigley Ski Club, a private club near Blue Mountain Resort. It was in this exclusive world of skiing and winter sports that James and Ashley eventually crossed paths. James had chosen a different career from his family's world of entertainment and philanthropy. In his early 20s, he joined the Brampton Fire and Emergency Services. He was athletic, fit, and calm under pressure. Over the years, he rose through the ranks, eventually becoming a fire captain by 2021. His colleagues knew him as someone who was dedicated to public service, someone who participated in community programs like smoke alarm checks. He seemed by all accounts to be a good man. James and Ashley began dating in their early 30s. They shared a love of the outdoors, of skiing, of the mountains. They seemed like a natural fit. James was charismatic, and Ashley was warm and open. They fell in love quickly, and in September of 2012, they married at the Craigley Ski Club, the very place where they had met. Together, they settled into a Tudor-style red brick house in Collingwood that overlooked hiking trails. They welcomed two children into their lives, a son and a daughter. They got a dog named Rocco. From the outside, their life looked idyllic. James had a respected career. Ashley was building her own professional success. They lived in a beautiful home in a beautiful town, surrounded by nature and community. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. By 2018, the pressures of daily life were starting to weigh on the Schwalm marriage. James's work as a fire captain meant long shifts and irregular hours, leaving little time for social connection or family life. Ashley, meanwhile, was thriving professionally, but balancing her career with raising two young children was demanding. The couple began to drift. Around 2021, something happened that would alter the trajectory of their marriage. Irrevocably, Ashley began an affair with her boss. It wasn't a long affair, but when James discovered it in 2022, the revelation devastated whatever trust remained between them. Ashley changed jobs to ease the tension. The couple sought counseling, trying to patch things together for the sake of their children, but the damage was done. In January of 2023, James began his own affair with a woman named Alexandra, who happened to be the ex-wife of Ashley's former boss, the same boss Ashley had been involved with. James confided in Alexandra about his frustrations at home, about the state of his marriage, about his growing sense of unhappiness. At the same time, financial pressures were mounting. Ashley had two life insurance policies. One was worth $250,000, with their children as beneficiaries. The other was worth $1 million, and James was the sole beneficiary. This detail would later take on enormous significance. In the weeks leading up to late January, James began researching things online. He searched for information about alimony. He looked up the costs of divorce in Ontario. He searched for details about car fires, about whether gasoline could completely destroy evidence, about whether deleted search history on an iPhone could be recovered. He even asked a doctor at a social gathering whether it was possible to kill someone by snapping their neck. All of these searches, all of these questions, painted a picture of a man contemplating something dark. But no one around him knew what was forming in his mind. By late January 2023, neighbors began to notice tension in the Schwalm household. Voices could be heard through walls. Arguments echoed in the night. The evening of January 25, 2023 was tense in the Schwalm home. The children went to bed, but the house was not quiet. Raised voices disturbed the stillness of the winter night. Ashley and James were arguing, though the children couldn't hear the details. Their son woke up to the sound of his parents fighting. He got out of bed and went to see what was happening. When Ashley saw him, she asked him to get her phone. She wanted to call the police. The boy saw James crying, saw him putting on a coat. James told his son that he was going to take Rocco, their dog, for a walk. The boy went back to bed, confused and frightened. Their daughter later recalled hearing a loud thump during the night, though she didn't leave her room. Sometime between 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning on January 26th, James strangled Ashley in the hallway of their home. The life they had built together, the family they had created, ended in those dark early morning hours. Ashley fought. Those who knew her were certain of that. She would have fought for her children, for her life, for a chance to escape. But it wasn't enough. James then set about staging a scene. He dressed Ashley in hiking clothes, winter gear that made it look like she had been planning an outdoor excursion. He carried her body to her black Mitsubishi Outlander SUV. He placed her in the passenger seat. Then he took her phone and began sending himself text messages, creating a false narrative. The messages made it seem like Ashley had gone for an early morning hike, that she was feeling dizzy, that she was experiencing vertigo. James drove the SUV with Ashley's body inside to a remote area near the Alpine Ski Club, a place he knew well. He positioned the vehicle at the edge of a ditch along Arrowhead Road, near Highway 26 in the Blue Mountains. He poured gasoline inside the car, over Ashley's body, over the seats. Then he tossed in a lighter that had his initials engraved on it, JWS for James William Schwalm. At approximately 5:45 in the morning, James lit the fire. The car erupted in flames. The smell of burning rubber and gasoline filled the cold air. James walked away from the scene, leaving footprints in the snow behind him. He walked to where he had parked his mother's car, a Hyundai Kona which he had driven to the area earlier. Video footage would later show a figure carrying a backpack, walking through a ski run parking lot. James drove back to Collingwood, arriving home around 6 in the morning. He used a snowblower to clear the driveway, making it look like a normal morning routine. Later, he sent both children to school, as if nothing had happened. At approximately 6 o'clock in the morning, a driver passing along Arrowhead Road noticed flames in a ditch below the road. The fire was intense. The smell of gasoline was overwhelming. The driver called 911. The Blue Mountain firefighters arrived within minutes. They worked quickly to extinguish the blaze, but the heat had been extreme. When they looked inside the charred remains of the SUV, they found a body in the passenger footwell. The body was burned beyond recognition, too damaged for immediate visual identification. The Ontario Provincial Police were called to the scene. Officers walked the perimeter, noting details: footprints in the snow leading from the driver's door up to the road, a lighter nearby with initials scratched into it, the license plate still partially visible, registered to a James Schwalm of Collingwood. By later that afternoon, dental records confirmed what investigators suspected. The body was Ashley Jane Schwalm, 40 years old, mother of 2, but the autopsy revealed something that changed everything. Ashley had not died in the fire. She had been strangled before the car was ever set ablaze. This was not an accident. This was murder. The investigation moved quickly. Detectives interviewed James that same afternoon. He told them that Ashley had gone for an early morning hike at the Craigley Ski Club. He showed them text messages between him and Ashley, messages that seemed to corroborate his story. He claimed he had taken Rocco for a walk before she left. But investigators were skeptical. They began pulling apart James's story piece by piece. First, they spoke to the children. The son told them what he had witnessed the night before, the arguing, his mother asking for her phone, his father crying and putting on a coat, the claim about walking the dog, even though the boy later saw Rocco still in the sunroom. Next, investigators examined cell phone data. James's phone pinged off cell towers near the ditch where the car was found, right around the time the fire was set. Surveillance footage tracked the movements of his mother's Hyundai Kona along the route from Collingwood to the scene and back. The in-car navigation system in the Kona showed that the engine had been turned on at 6:01 in the morning. Residential cameras along the way captured footage of a figure wearing a backpack, walking quickly through the streets. One camera caught the person parking the Kona at Admiral Collingwood Elementary and running toward the Schwalm residence. Investigators obtained a warrant for James's phone and computer. His browser history was damning. In the days before Ashley's death, he had searched for misspelled terms like Alamany, does a road flare completely burn, and can you see iPhone history after deleted. They also discovered the text messages between James and his girlfriend, Alexandra. In one message sent just days before the murder, James had written that he planned to focus on his own happiness. Perhaps most telling was the lighter. The initials JWS belonged to James William Schwalm. It had been left at the scene, a piece of evidence that directly tied him to the crime. Investigators also learned about the life insurance policies. Ashley had a $1 million policy with James as the sole beneficiary, combined with his online searches about alimony and divorce costs. A motive began to crystallize. James believed that killing Ashley was preferable to divorcing her. He thought he could stage an accident, collect the insurance money, and move on with his life. On February 3rd, 2023, exactly 1 week after Ashley's body was discovered, Ontario Provincial Police arrested James Schwalm at his home. He was charged with second-degree murder and indignity to a dead body. The murder charge was later upgraded to first-degree murder on February 17th. The children were placed in the care of Ashley's brother, David, and his wife, Tia. A no-contact order ensured that James would not be able to reach them. On February 10th, 2025, Ontario Superior Court Justice Michelle First sentenced James to life in prison with no chance of parole for 20 years. It was the maximum sentence allowed for second-degree murder. During the sentencing hearing, more than 20 victim impact statements were read aloud. Family members and friends spoke about the woman Ashley had been, about the hole her absence left in their lives. Justice First spoke directly to James's betrayal. She noted that his actions were completely at odds with his responsibility as a firefighter to save lives, not take them. She called Ashley's murder an act of egregious selfishness, cold, callous, and calculated. James expressed remorse in court, saying he was haunted by what he had done and that he never thought he was capable of such a crime. But his words rang hollow to those who had loved Ashley. He showed little emotion as Ashley's family members watched him from the courtroom. The no-contact order with his children remains in place until they turn 18. James will not be eligible for parole until 2045. He remains in a provincial correctional facility in Ontario. Ashley's children, now 8 and 11 years old, are being raised by their aunt and uncle, away from the shadow of what their father did. They are being shielded from the worst details, allowed to grieve and heal in their own time. The family hopes that as they grow older, they will remember their mother, not for how she died, but for how she lived. Friends and family remember Ashley as someone who made everyone feel special. She had a gift for connection, for making people feel heard and valued. She loved hiking, skiing, playing golf and tennis. She loved her children fiercely. She worked hard and built a career she was proud of. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a mother. She was loved. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight we'll journey through a story that, while tragic, reminds us of the fragility of life and the importance of the connections we hold dear. The summer air in Louisiana hangs heavy, thick with humidity and the promise of long evenings. In the early morning hours of June 21st, 2015, as the darkness before dawn held the city of New Orleans in its grasp, something terrible was unfolding in the eastern part of the city. By the time the sun rose that Father's Day morning, a young mother's life would be over, and her family would begin a journey through grief that would reshape everything they knew about justice, safety, and loss. This is the story of Lindsay Nichols, a 31-year-old woman with bright blue eyes and a warm smile, a woman who loved her 9-year-old son more than anything in the world. It's a story about a night that started with laughter and friendship and ended in unimaginable violence, but it's also a story about determination, about a mother seeking answers, about detectives piecing together fragments of evidence, and about a system that failed at a critical moment. Let's go back to the beginning. Lindsay Nichols was originally from Louisiana, from a small community called Des Allemands. She had recently moved back to the area after working in Texas as a timekeeper for a construction company. The weekend before her death, she'd been excited, full of energy and plans. She had just moved into a new trailer home in Des Allemands, and her mother, Jolene Dufresne, had helped her move furniture in on Friday. It was one of those ordinary moments that become precious in hindsight. A mother and daughter working together, talking about the future, arranging a home. Lindsay had a young son who meant everything to her. At 9 years old, he was at that age where every day brought new discoveries, new questions about the world. Lindsay was devoted to him, and her family would later speak about how she lit up whenever she talked about her boy. She was building a life for them, creating stability, working hard. That Saturday night, Lindsay decided to go out with friends in New Orleans. It was meant to be a simple evening, the kind of night out that young adults enjoy. A break from responsibilities, a chance to laugh and dance and feel free for a few hours. Her friends were ready to leave the club around 4 in the morning, as the night stretched toward dawn, but Lindsay wanted to stay out a bit longer. She was friendly, social, the kind of person who enjoyed meeting new people and having conversations. Her friends didn't think much of it. They knew Lindsay could take care of herself. At some point during the evening, Lindsay met a man at a place called the Tiki Hut, a nightclub on Downman Road in New Orleans East. Her friends would later recall that she'd been talking to someone she called Bam. They didn't recognize him, but Lindsay seemed comfortable and they didn't see any cause for concern. She was a grown woman after all, making her own choices about how to spend her night. The man Lindsay had met was named Fion Sampson. He was 30 years old, worked as a barber, and also performed as an exotic dancer under the stage name Bonafide or sometimes Bone. He lived in an apartment complex in New Orleans East, in the 6,000 block of Chef Menteur Highway, right next to a car dealership called Banner Chevrolet. What happened next would be pieced together later through phone records, surveillance footage, and the most haunting piece of evidence, a 911 call that would make even seasoned detectives pause in disbelief. Between 4:11 and 4:18 in the morning, Lindsay called Sampson's phone twice. Somehow in the early hours of that Sunday morning, she ended up in the parking lot of the apartment complex where he lived, sitting in her 2011 Honda Accord. The exact sequence of events remains unclear, lost in the darkness of that night, but what is certain is that something went terribly wrong. At 4:45 in the morning, Lindsay Nichols made a desperate call to 911. Her voice was frightened, urgent. She told the emergency operator that a man was outside her car, that he had taken her keys, that he was pointing a gun at her. She gave the location, an apartment complex near the intersection of Chef Menteur Highway and Downman Road, right by a car dealership. As the call continued, the operator could hear Lindsay's voice becoming more distressed. In the background, a male voice began to scream profanities at her. The man was accusing Lindsay of giving his address to someone else. On the recording, Lindsay could be heard saying, "He tried to do something to me that I didn't want to do." She said, "He's got a gun. He's in my face. He took my keys." The sounds that followed were horrifying. Lindsay moaned, gasped. There were sounds of a physical attack, of violence unfolding in real time. At one point, the dispatcher's notes would later indicate that the man could be heard demanding that Lindsay open her mouth so he could place the gun inside it. The call lasted 13 minutes. By 4:58, the line went dead, but help did not come. This is where the first failure occurred, a failure that would haunt Lindsay's mother for years to come. The 911 operator, a woman named Trava Sip, who had been on the job for 16 months, did not immediately dispatch officers to the scene. 8 minutes passed between when Lindsay made her desperate call and when a police officer was sent to help. 8 minutes that might have made all the difference. And there was something else. The operator failed to tell the responding officers the most critical detail, that the man threatening Lindsay had a gun. She never communicated the full urgency of the situation. The officers who were sent had no idea they were responding to a life-threatening emergency. They arrived on what's called a low-level response, treating it as a routine call. An officer who was only 3 blocks away was eventually dispatched. He and his partner spent about 15 minutes searching the parking lot of the apartment complex, looking for Lindsay, for her car, for any sign of what had happened. But they found nothing. No victim. No vehicle. No scene. The call was marked as unfounded at 5:10 in the morning. By 5:13, the officers had moved on to a traffic stop. Lindsay Nichols had vanished into the early morning darkness. About 2 hours later, at 7:15, firefighters with the New Orleans Fire Department responded to a call about a burning vehicle on a deserted stretch of Matude Boulevard, near Lake Forest Boulevard, about 8 miles from where Lindsay had made her 911 call. It was a remote area, the kind of place where someone might abandon a car if they didn't want it to be found quickly. When the firefighters extinguished the flames and looked inside the vehicle, they made a horrifying discovery. In the trunk of the burned-out Honda Accord was a body, curled in a fetal position, severely burned. It was Lindsay Nichols. The Orleans Parish Coroner's Office would later determine that Lindsay had suffered an almost unimaginable amount of trauma before she died. She had been shot multiple times, 6 bullets to be precise. She had been manually strangled, the kind of attack that requires close, sustained pressure. Her face had been battered. A bone in her neck had been snapped. The medical examiner would testify that the injuries were extensive, that someone had to have been consumed with rage or hatred to inflict that level of violence. Detective Sergeant Robert Barrere of the New Orleans Police Department Homicide Division was assigned to lead the investigation. A veteran detective, Barrere had seen many crime scenes in his career, but this one stood out. The brutality was shocking. As he would later say, it was a lot of injuries. Someone had to be super angry or hateful. Something happened to set them off to do this to this young girl. The investigation began with the physical evidence at the scene. Inside the burned trunk of Lindsay's car, Detective Barrere found a partially burned plastic bag containing blood-stained clothing, a white tank top undershirt, tube socks, and a distinctive pair of red and one brand basketball shorts. These items had been intended to burn with the car, to be consumed by the flames, but they had survived and they would become crucial to solving the case. Barrere and his team also began looking into Lindsay's phone records. When they did, they discovered something that made their hearts sink. Lindsay had called 911. She had begged for help, and somehow that call had not resulted in her rescue. When the detectives listened to the recording of Lindsay's 911 call, their reaction was visceral. Our jaws dropped, Barrere would later say. It was the worst call I ever heard on the job. The sounds of Lindsay's terror, the violence captured in audio form, the knowledge that help had not arrived in time. It was almost unbearable. The 911 operator, Travis Sitt, would eventually resign while under investigation for her handling of the call. The case highlighted systemic issues in the New Orleans emergency response system. Response times had been increasing over the years, and in this case, the delay had been fatal. But Barrere couldn't change what had happened. All he could do was find out who was responsible and bring them to justice. Lindsay's phone records showed several calls to a man named Thayon Sampson. Her friends confirmed that she had met someone at the club that night, someone called Bam. When detectives looked into Sampson's background, they discovered he was an exotic dancer who performed under names that sounded similar, Bonafide or Bone. The pieces were starting to fit together. Detectives learned that Sampson lived in an apartment at the exact address Lindsay had given to the 911 operator, the apartment complex next to the car dealership on Chef Mentor Highway. This could not be a coincidence. Cell tower records placed Sampson's phone near the same cell tower as Lindsay's phone at the time of her 911 call. Even more damning, his phone pinged towers near the Mechute Boulevard location, the spot where Lindsay's body had been found, twice that morning, once at 5:29 and again at 7:07, right around the time the car was set on fire. Detective Barrere brought Sampson in for questioning. The suspect was calm, almost unnaturally relaxed. He admitted that he had met Lindsay at the nightclub, that they had hit it off, that he had even hugged her. He claimed that when she called his phone twice in the early morning hours, he didn't answer. He said he went straight home after leaving the club and stayed there the rest of the night with his girlfriend and a friend named Troy Vernado. He volunteered to give a DNA sample. After all, he explained, if his DNA was on Lindsay, it would be from that hug at the club. He seemed confident, almost hopeful. But Barrere had one more card to play. He had been digging through Sampson's social media accounts, looking for anything that might connect him more directly to the crime. And then he found it, on Sampson's Instagram account, posted just about a week before Lindsay's murder. There was a photograph of Sampson wearing a distinctive pair of red and one basketball shorts. They looked identical to the blood-stained shorts found in Lindsay's trunk. When the DNA results came back from the state crime lab, they confirmed what Barrere suspected. Sampson's DNA was present on the inner waistband of those blood-soaked shorts. The shorts that had been in the trunk with Lindsay's body. The shorts that Sampson had been photographed wearing just days before the murder. On July 21st, 2015, exactly 1 month after Lindsay's death, Detective Barrere obtained an arrest warrant. Police picked up Thayon Sampson outside a tattoo shop and booked him for second-degree murder. His bond was set at $2.5 million. But as the investigation continued, detectives began to suspect that Sampson hadn't acted alone. The 911 call had captured at least two male voices in the background. There were questions about how Lindsay had been transported from the apartment complex to Michoud Boulevard. Sampson had mentioned being with someone that night, a friend named Troy Varnado. Troy Varnado Jr. was 30 years old. Cell phone tower data showed that his phone had been in the area where Lindsay's body was found. At the critical time, text messages between Varnado and Sampson in the days after the murder showed them discussing video games, casual conversations that seemed chilling given what had happened. Then there were the letters. While in jail, Sampson had written letters, including one intended for Varnado. In it, he wrote about how they were supposed to be in this together. He referenced discussing the idea of blaming the murder on a dead man, a plan that Varnado had apparently shot down. The implication was clear. Both men knew what had happened, because both men had been involved. In May of 2017, nearly 2 years after Lindsay's murder, an Orleans Parish grand jury indicted Troy Varnado on multiple charges: second-degree murder, second-degree kidnapping, obstruction of justice, and acting as an accessory after the fact to Lindsay's killing. The case that prosecutors would eventually build suggested that both Sampson and Varnado had participated in Lindsay's murder. The theory was that Lindsay had gone to Sampson's apartment, that something had happened there, something she didn't consent to. Prosecutors believed that the men had tried to force Lindsay into a sexual encounter, and when she refused, violence erupted. Lindsay had run from the apartment in her underwear, according to this theory, making that desperate 911 call. But instead of help arriving, Sampson and Varnado had caught up with her. They had beaten her, shot her, strangled her. Then they had driven her body miles away to that desolate stretch of road and set her car ablaze, hoping to destroy the evidence of their crime. The case went to trial in September of 2018, but there would be a twist that surprised many who had followed the story. On September 7th, 2018, just days before his trial was set to begin, Thion Sampson appeared in court and entered a guilty plea, rather than face a trial for second-degree murder, which could have resulted in a life sentence. Sampson pleaded guilty to an amended charge of manslaughter. He also pleaded guilty to second-degree kidnapping, obstruction of justice, and solicitation of murder. That last charge, solicitation of murder, referred to an additional crime that had come to light. While in jail, Sampson had written a letter attempting to arrange for someone to kill his co-defendant, Troy Varnado. The man who had allegedly helped him commit murder was now someone he wanted silenced. As part of the plea agreement, which was approved by Lindsay's family, Sampson was sentenced to 40 years in prison without the possibility of parole, probation, or suspension of sentence. It was the maximum sentence allowed for manslaughter. Lindsay's mother, Jolene Dufresne, sat in the courtroom as Sampson entered his plea. She had photos of her daughter. With her, images of Lindsay's bright blue eyes and warm smile. The courtroom proceedings spared the family from having to sit through a full trial, from having to hear the 911 call played in open court, from having to listen to all the details of Lindsay's final moments. But it didn't bring Lindsay back. District Attorney Leon Canizaro spoke to the press after the plea, calling it one of the most horrific crimes seen in New Orleans in recent years. He praised the work of Detective Barrera and the prosecutors who had built the case. But Sampson's guilty plea left many questions about Troy Varnado's role. Sampson had agreed to testify against Varnado as part of his deal with prosecutors. But when the time came, when Sampson was called to the witness stand during Varnado's trial, he refused to speak. He wouldn't answer a single question, not even to confirm his own name. He sat silently, defying the court, risking contempt charges rather than testify against his former friend. Varnado's trial proceeded without Sampson's testimony. The jury heard the 911 call, that haunting 13-minute recording of Lindsay's last moments of consciousness. They heard about the cell phone data placing Varnado near the scene. They heard about the text messages and the letters Sampson had written from jail. Prosecutors argued that Varnado had been angry because Lindsay wouldn't have sex with him, that he and Sampson had worked together to kill her. They pointed to the evidence showing Varnado's presence at key locations at critical times. They noted that after the murder, Varnado and Sampson had exchanged casual messages, with no sign that Varnado was afraid of Sampson or traumatized by what he'd witnessed. Varnado's defense attorneys argued that their client had been present but not a participant, that he had been a terrified bystander, perhaps coerced by Samson. They suggested that Samson's brother, not Vernado, might have been the second person involved. They faulted Detective Barrere for not conducting a voice analysis of the 911 call to definitively identify who was speaking in the background. On September 19th, 2018, after deliberating for just over 3 hours, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty. Troy Vernado Jr. was convicted of second-degree murder, second-degree kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. At his sentencing hearing in November of that year, Lindsay's family and friends gave victim impact statements. Her mother, Jolene Dufresne, spoke about what she had lost. She talked about Lindsay's blue eyes, about the phone calls where Lindsay would ask how to prepare food, about all the small moments that make up a mother-daughter relationship. She talked about her grandson, Lindsay's 9-year-old son, and how she would have to explain to him how his mother died. She listed all the milestones he would experience without his mother there. Basketball games, prom, graduation, his wedding day. Jolene said she felt sympathy for Vernado's family, believing they probably hadn't raised him to be this evil person. But for Vernado himself, she said, "I don't have 1 ounce of compassion." She told him, "I hope it haunts you." When given a chance to speak, Vernado offered condolences to Lindsay's family. He mentioned that he had lost the mother of his children about 2 years earlier, and said, "For what it's worth, I know what you're going through." But then he said something that stunned the courtroom. "I want to also say that this isn't justice for Lindsay. Justice would be getting the people who done this." Even after his conviction, Vernado maintained his innocence. Judge Robin Pittman sentenced him to life in prison. Vernado filed an appeal, but in January of 2020, a 3-judge panel unanimously affirmed his conviction and sentence. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars. In the years since Lindsay's death, her case has been featured in multiple true crime television programs. An episode of The First 48 documented the investigation. The Oxygen Network produced an episode about her case for a series called Murdered by Morning. Each time, producers reached out to Jolene Dufresne, asking to tell Lindsay's story. Jolene has participated in these documentaries, painful as it is, because she wants people to remember Lindsay not as a victim but as a person, as a mother, as a daughter. She wants young people to understand the importance of staying together when they go out, of being careful about who they trust. There are predators out there, she has said, and they come in all forms. She also wants people to know about the failure of the 911 system that night. Lindsay called for help. She did everything right. She tried to get the authorities involved before the violence escalated. But the help she needed didn't arrive in time. That failure, that 8-minute delay, that decision not to communicate the full danger to responding officers, it haunts everyone who has studied this case. Would Lindsay have survived if officers had been dispatched immediately? If they had known about the gun? If they had treated the call as the life-threatening emergency it was? These are questions that can never be answered, but they linger like ghosts. What we know for certain is this. On Father's Day in 2015, a young woman who had just moved into a new home, who had a son she loved dearly, who had her whole life ahead of her, went out for a night with friends in New Orleans. She met someone at a club, someone who seemed friendly enough, and in the early morning hours in the parking lot of an apartment complex, something went terribly, violently wrong. Lindsay Nichols fought for her life. She called for help. She tried to survive. But in the end, the violence was too much, and the help arrived too late. She left behind a 9-year-old boy who would grow up without his mother, parents who would grieve for the rest of their lives, and friends who would never forget her warmth and kindness. 2 men are now in prison for their roles in her death. Theon Sampson, serving 40 years, and Troy Vernado, serving life without parole. But no amount of prison time can undo what happened on that Father's Day morning. No verdict can bring Lindsay back to her family. Her story serves as a reminder of how quickly an ordinary night can turn tragic, how vulnerable we all are, how important it is that our emergency systems work when we need them most. It's a story of violence and loss, but also of a mother's enduring love, of a detective's determination to find the truth, and of a family's courage in facing unimaginable grief. Lindsay Nichols was 31 years old when she died. She should have had decades ahead of her, should have watched her son grow into a man, should have celebrated holidays and birthdays and all the small joys that make up a life. Instead, her story ended on a deserted stretch of road in New Orleans East, in flames and darkness. But while her life was cut short, she is not forgotten. Her family keeps her memory alive. Her case reminds law enforcement and emergency dispatchers of the critical importance of every call, every response, every moment of urgency. And her story, told and retold, ensures that Lindsay Nichols will be remembered, not just for how she died, but for who she was. A daughter, a mother, a friend, a woman who deserved so much more than the violence that took her life. As we close this story tonight, let us think of Lindsay's bright blue eyes, her love for her son, her hopes for the future. Let us remember that behind every true crime story is a real person, someone whose absence leaves a hole in the world. And let us carry forward the lessons her issue teaches us about vigilance, about the systems we trust to protect us, and about the preciousness of every single life. Rest well, dear listener, and may Lindsay Nichols rest in peace. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we travel to Holly Springs, North Carolina, to a case that would test the limits of justice and become a landmark in the fight against domestic violence. This is a story of a young mother, her dreams, her struggles, and the determined investigators who refuse to give up on finding answers. In the spring of 2019, Holly Springs, North Carolina was like many small towns dotting the landscape of the American South. It's the kind of place where neighbors know each other, where families grow, where life unfolds at a gentler pace. The town sits just south of Raleigh, nestled in Wake County, a community of tree-lined streets and apartment complexes, restaurants and small businesses. It was here that Monica Day Moynihan lived with her 2 young daughters. At 22 years old, she was building a life for herself and her children. Monica was small in stature, just 5 feet 1 inch tall, and 115 pounds. But those who knew her described her as having an enormous presence. Her brown hair, which she often dyed vibrant colors like green, framed a face that was quick to smile. Her arms and body bore tattoos that told stories. A watercolor fox on her shoulder, a Celtic symbol, a warrior princess on her calf, a sun on her finger, a shamrock behind her ear. Monica was a dreamer and a doer. She worked as a waitress at a restaurant in nearby Fuquay, Varina, serving customers with the same warmth and dedication she brought to everything in her life. But she had bigger plans. She had started her own small business, making and selling elderberry syrup, which she called Monty's Magic. It was meant to offer healthy options for families, for children. She believed in natural remedies, in taking care of people. More than that, Monica had recently enrolled in training to become a doula. She wanted to help bring life into the world, to support mothers during one of the most vulnerable and beautiful moments of their lives. She'd paid for the course, and was excited to begin in late April. Her children were everything to her, a 4-year-old daughter and a 1-year-old baby. Her mother, Melanie Tucker, would later describe Monica as a wonderful, warm, free-spirited, strong-minded, hard-working mother who was constantly striving to do what was best for her daughters. But there was a shadow in Monica's life, a presence that wouldn't let her go. Monica had met Brian Sluss when she was just 17 years old. She'd gone to interview for a job at Office Max, and Brian was the one who hired her. He was 32 years old at the time, married with 2 children of his own. But he lied about his age when he first showed interest in Monica. By the time she learned the truth, feelings had already developed. When Monica turned 18, she made the decision to move in with Brian. Her parents didn't approve. They didn't like the age difference. They didn't trust Brian, and they told Monica as much. But young love, or what Monica believed was love, has a way of feeling like the most important thing in the world. She moved in with him anyway. What followed were years of what court documents would later describe as a volatile relationship. It wasn't the fairy tale Monica might have hoped for. Instead, it was marked by patterns of control, of jealousy, of violence. Monica's co-workers at the restaurant began to notice things. One manager would later testify that she'd seen Brian physically drag Monica out of the restaurant on more than one occasion. Monica would come to work with bruises that she tried to hide, but they were there, visible to those who looked closely enough. The bruises got bigger, more widespread, harder to conceal as the months passed. In May of 2016, Monica took a brave step. She filed for a domestic violence protective order against Brian. The court documents painted a disturbing picture. Monica stated that Brian had punched and choked her in October of 2015. Just 2 months later, in December, he had hit her again, tackled her, thrown her. The court concluded that there was danger of serious and immediate injury to both Monica and her child from Brian. After the protective order was issued, Monica and Brian broke up. But Brian didn't accept the end of the relationship. He continued to stalk Monica, to text her incessantly. The harassment was so persistent that he was arrested for violating the protective order and for domestic violence. Still, somehow, they ended up back together. It's a pattern seen far too often in abusive relationships. The cycle of violence, separation promises to change, and reconciliation. Monica gave birth to their second daughter in August of 2018, but the birth of their child didn't bring peace to their home. Instead, the domestic violence escalated. In early 2019, police responded to another domestic disturbance call. Monica told officers that Brian had pushed her down to the floor in the kitchen and punched her in the left side of her head with his right fist. In January of that year, Brian pleaded guilty to assault on a female in connection with a 2017 incident in which Monica had called police saying he choked her. Monica's best friend, Alex Wilson, would later testify about conversations they'd had. Monica had come to her on 2 separate occasions, describing incidents where Brian had choked her. She told her friend that during one of these attacks, she saw the lights go out. She said she almost died. Despite everything, Monica stayed. Perhaps she hoped things would change. Perhaps she felt trapped. Perhaps she worried about her children, about money, about whether she could make it on her own. Whatever the reasons, in early 2019, Monica was still living with Brian Sluss in an apartment on Timber Springs Court in Holly Springs. April 7th. 2019 was a Sunday. Monica was working her shift at the restaurant in Fakavia. The evening unfolded like any other. She served customers, she chatted with coworkers, she did her job. When her shift ended, she left the restaurant. Text message records would later show that Monica arrived home in the early morning hours of April 7th. And then something happened. Something that would change everything. After that night, no one saw Monica Moynihan again. But here's what made the case so particularly cruel, so particularly calculated. For months after Monica disappeared, her family and friends had no idea she was gone. They received text messages from her phone. They saw posts on her Instagram account. Everything seemed normal. The messages matched Monica's texting style. Her mother, Melanie, did notice that Monica had stopped calling her. Usually they spoke on the phone at least once every 2 weeks, and Monica would visit once a week. But the text messages kept coming. And so Melanie's concern, while present, wasn't yet alarm. Monica's manager at the restaurant also received text from Monica's phone. Messages explaining why she was missing work. She was sick. Her vehicle had broken down. It went on for 4 weeks. The manager found it odd because Monica had been such a reliable employee. She was always on time, never missed work. But the text seemed to be from Monica, so what could she do but accept the explanations? Meanwhile, the apartment manager at Monica's complex began to notice something strange. She saw Brian Sluss at the apartment all the time. He was there constantly, going in and out with the 2 young children. But she hadn't seen Monica at all. Not since late March. The apartment management had actually issued a trespass order against Brian, forbidding him from being on the property. Yet there he was, living in Monica's apartment, using her car, caring for the children. On July 19th, 2019, more than 3 months after anyone had actually seen Monica, her mother Melanie Tucker called the Holly Springs Police Department. She asked them to do a wellness check on her daughter. Something didn't feel right. The phone calls had stopped entirely. The text messages, while still coming, felt wrong somehow. A mother's intuition is a powerful thing. The apartment manager had also reached out to Melanie, expressing her own concerns. She told Melanie that she hadn't seen Monica in months. Only Brian and the children. When police arrived at the apartment on July 23rd, they found Brian Sluss there with Monica's 2 daughters. The apartment manager confirmed what she'd already told Melanie. She hadn't seen Monica since March. She'd only been able to make contact with her via email and text messages. But she had seen the children the night before, in Brian's care. Melanie told police that she usually saw her daughter once a week, but she hadn't actually seen Monica since March either. Only those text messages. When police questioned Brian Sluss, his story was disturbing. He told them that he hadn't seen Monica since June 20th. He claimed that shortly after she began working at the restaurant, Monica had become addicted to heroin. He said that in mid-June he tried to have her go through what he called home rehab, where he kept her in the apartment and tried to get her to quit cold turkey. He claimed that on June 20th, he received a text from Monica with a picture of one of their daughters and the words, "I can't do this anymore." He said he never heard from her again after that. The police officer asked Brian why he had been texting Melanie and pretending to be her daughter. Brian said he didn't know how to tell her that Monica was addicted to heroin and was missing. When asked why he didn't file a missing persons report, he said he expected her to come home. It was a story that didn't hold up under even basic scrutiny. Monica's family and friends were adamant. She would never have left her children. Not willingly. Not for drugs, not for anything. Her children were her life. The restaurant manager was equally skeptical. She told police that she'd witnessed Monica's relationship with Brian and knew it was abusive. A bartender who worked with Monica revealed that Monica had shown her bruises from assaults and had once said something chilling. "When something happens to me, I don't know what will happen to my kids." Once Monica was officially reported missing, Holly Springs police began a thorough investigation. What they discovered was deeply troubling. Monica hadn't used her credit card since April 7th. She hadn't been to work. She hadn't been seen by anyone. Her phone records showed activity, but it was Brian who had her phone. He'd been driving her car, the one with the car seats for the children. He'd been posting on her Instagram account, texting her friends and family, creating an elaborate fiction that Monica was alive and well. Investigators found that before April 7th, Monica's internet search history reflected her real interests and goals. Searches about becoming a doula, about caring for children, about elderberry syrup and natural health. After April 7th, the phone was used to search for pornography sites. Monica's credit cards, which she hadn't used herself, had been used to pay for Brian's dating site subscriptions. Police searched Monica's apartment multiple times. They found a positive pregnancy test in a box of tests. Monica's friend confirmed that Monica believed she was pregnant at the time of her disappearance. Investigators would later theorize that this pregnancy may have been a factor in what happened to Monica. Perhaps Brian didn't want another child. Perhaps Monica's pregnancy represented another tie that would keep her in his life. Another complication he didn't want to deal with. When investigators examined the kitchen area of Monica's apartment in August, they noticed signs of a possible cleanup on the tiles. They removed 35 tiles from the floor and made a critical discovery. A large amount of human blood had been present in the cracks between the tiles. That blood was later confirmed through DNA testing to belong to Monica Moynihan. A neighbor came forward with another piece of the puzzle. She told police that 2 or 3 days after April 7th, around 3 o'clock in the morning, she saw Brian coming in and out of Monica's apartment with a big black trash bag, going back and forth, carrying something heavy under the cover of darkness. The investigation also revealed something about Monica's shopping habits. It showed Brian had taken over her life completely. A police lieutenant testified about Monica's pattern of using her EBT card and her Lowe's loyalty card together when shopping. From January 22nd through April 5th, the two cards were always used in tandem. Monica had a routine. She would buy cat food, Pampers, baby food, and baby wipes in a habitual bi-weekly fashion. But starting April 7th, everything changed. Monica's EBT card was now being used in conjunction with a Lowe's loyalty card belonging to Jarlyn Lisbeth Sluss, Brian's ex-wife. It was evidence that Monica wasn't the one shopping anymore. She wasn't the one taking care of her children's needs. By October of 2019, Holly Springs police officially announced that they were investigating Monica's disappearance as a murder, though her body had never been found. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Brian hadn't been acting entirely alone. His ex-wife Jarlyn Sluss had become involved in the cover-up. On April 7th, the day Monica disappeared, Brian called Jarlyn. Prior to that day, they hadn't been in regular communication. But after April 7th, Brian and Jarlyn were in constant contact. They texted, they called, they video chatted on Skype. Police monitored their communications and discovered something damning. In one conversation, Jarlin asked Brian if police would ever find Monica. Brian's response was simple and chilling. No. Jarlin had also admitted to police that she pretended to be Monica in a phone call to the apartment management. She was helping Brian maintain the fiction that Monica was alive, helping him buy time. Investigators searched Jarlin's home in Garner, North Carolina. They also traveled to Bluefield, Virginia to search the home of Brian's parents. There they checked the soil, took samples, searched the property and surrounding areas for any sign of Monica's remains. They found evidence, they collected items, but Monica's body was never recovered. In May of 2020, more than a year after Monica's disappearance, a Wake County grand jury indicted Brian Sluss for Monica's murder. He was arrested at his parents' home in Bluefield, Virginia on a Tuesday afternoon. He was 44 years old. The next day, he waived his right to extradition and was transported back to Wake County. Just days after Brian's arrest, Jarlin Sluss was also arrested. She was charged with obstruction of justice and accessory to murder after the fact. Authorities said that Jarlin had information about Monica's disappearance for months, but had made no effort to help the investigation. Instead, she chose to help Brian cover up what he had done. The trial of Brian Sluss began in April of 2022, nearly 3 years after Monica disappeared. It was a case that would make history. It would be the first murder case in Wake County to be prosecuted without the victim's body being found. The state presented considerable testimony from people who had known Monica and Brian during their relationship. Monica's mother testified about how they met, about Brian lying about his age, about the escalating violence she witnessed over the years. Friends testified about the bruises they'd seen, about Monica's fear about her desire to get away from Brian. The restaurant manager testified about the abuse she'd witnessed, about Brian dragging Monica from the restaurant, about the bruises that got bigger and harder to hide as time went on. She testified that in early 2019, Monica had said Brian beat her up on Valentine's Day, and that by late March, the bruises were widespread and severe. Police officers testified about the domestic violence calls they'd responded to, about Monica's statements that Brian had choked her, pushed her, punched her. They testified about the blood found in the kitchen, about Brian's possession of Monica's car and phone, about the elaborate deception he'd carried out for months. Perhaps most powerful was the testimony of Alex Wilson, Monica's best friend. She described Monica as upbeat and loving, but struggling with self-esteem and desperately wanting out of her relationship with Brian. She testified about Monica coming to her twice, saying that Brian had choked her, that she'd seen the lights go out, that she almost died. The case hinged on a landmark piece of legislation called Brittany's Law. This North Carolina law, which had gone into effect in December of 2017, was named for Brittany Jordan Puryear, a 22-year-old woman who was shot and killed by her boyfriend in 2014, after years of abuse. The law allows prosecutors to charge first-degree murder in domestic violence cases, where the defendant has a previous conviction for domestic violence against the same victim. It creates a rebuttable presumption of premeditation based on the pattern of abuse. Brian Sluss would be the first person charged under Brittany's Law. He had pleaded guilty to assault on a female in January 2019, just months before Monica disappeared. That conviction, combined with the documented history of violence, allowed prosecutors to pursue first-degree murder charges even without Monica's body. In a dramatic moment in the trial, Brian Sluss decided to testify in his own defense. It would be the first time the public heard him speak since becoming a suspect in Monica's disappearance. His defense attorney tried to paint a picture of a relationship where Monica left of her own accord, but Brian's testimony was filled with inconsistencies. He admitted several times that he was bad with dates and timelines. When pressed on when he last saw Monica, he claimed it was around Father's Day weekend in 2019, which would have been 2 months after prosecutors said she vanished and was killed. He said Monica had made him a Father's Day dinner. No one else, however, had seen Monica after April 7th. Brian admitted that he and Monica had gotten into a fight. She took my phone and she asked me why I had certain Instagram girls on it. We got in an altercation and I did hit her and she did pack up her stuff and she did go to her parents. He testified. But if that was true, why hadn't anyone seen or heard from Monica? Why had her parents not seen her? Why had she not shown up to work or used her credit cards? When asked why he took so long to report her disappearance, Brian said 10 days in, and I had been freaking out. She would just show up and I was an idiot who got worried. I never thought she would not come back. During cross-examination, prosecutor Catherine Pomeroy pressed Brian hard. Literally, the mother of your kids is missing and you can't even check a calendar, she asked. Brian responded that he was focused on getting benefits for our kids. The prosecution showed that Brian had sent text messages to his sister after Monica's disappearance, asking about death and how to talk to someone about it. They showed surveillance video of Brian pacing in Monica's apartment, double-checking locks on doors and windows. They showed changes in his spending habits after Monica disappeared, including his use of her credit cards for his dating site subscriptions. Perhaps most shocking, prosecutors showed video of Brian punching one of his daughters, a young child, causing gasps throughout the courtroom. Through it all, Brian maintained that he had no clue where Monica is. Jarlyn Sluss, who had been charged as an accessory, pleaded guilty and testified against Brian. She confirmed that she had helped him impersonate Monica, making phone calls and assisting in the deception. After hearing all the evidence, the jury deliberated on April 28, 2022. They returned with their verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. When the verdict was read, Monica's family erupted in cheers and tears. Her mother, Melanie Tucker, wept. They embraced each other, finally feeling that justice had been served, even without Monica's body being found. Brian Sluss was immediately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Before sentencing, Monica's family was given the opportunity to address the court. The statements they made were raw with grief and anger. He was supposed to take care of her and protect her, but instead he killed her, said Monica's father, Curtis Moynihan. Her stepfather, Brandon Tucker, spoke about the agony the family continued to experience. There is a mental agony in knowing what you did to Moni, an agony that causes sleepless nights and leaves an eternal hole in our hearts. Melanie Tucker's victim impact statement was particularly emotional. She was a vibrant force. She was magnetic. Her energy was very strong, she said. A piece of our family puzzle is gone forever. I will never get to listen to her, be cozy with her, or talk to her about all the things. Literally all the things. Brian Sluss took that from us. He took her from all of our friends, her family, and her future. But most of all, he took a mother from her children. She called Brian a disgusting monster who deserved the worst punishment possible. She spoke about how he pretended to be Monica after killing her, calling it an act of evil. Prosecutor Catherine Pomeroy, who had worked tirelessly on the case, summed it up in her closing arguments. He threw her body away like she was trash. Monica wasn't trash. She was a friend. She was a sister. She was a daughter. Monica's body has never been found, despite extensive searches of properties in North Carolina and Virginia. Despite investigators' best efforts, Monica's remains are still out there somewhere. Brian Sluss is the only person who knows where she is, and he has never revealed that information. Melanie Tucker and her husband Brandon are now raising Monica's two daughters. Instead of being grandparents who get to spoil their grandchildren and send them home, they are parents again, raising two little girls who lost their mother to violence. The case marked several important milestones. It was the first murder conviction without a body in Wake County history. It was the first successful prosecution using Brittany's law, proving that the legislation could work to hold domestic violence perpetrators accountable for murder, even when proving traditional premeditation was difficult. But perhaps most importantly, the case brought attention to the insidious nature of domestic violence, to the way abusers can control and manipulate and isolate their victims, to the way violence escalates over time, often ending in death. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider the complexity of this case. Monica Moynihan was trying to build a better life. She had dreams of becoming a doula, of helping other mothers. She was making elderberry syrup to help families stay healthy. She loved her children fiercely, but she was trapped in a cycle of violence that she couldn't escape. Think about the dedication of the investigators who worked for years to bring Brian Sluss to justice, even without Monica's body. Think about the courage it took for Monica's friends and coworkers to come forward and testify about what they'd seen. Think about the grief of Monica's family who have to raise her children while living with the knowledge that they'll never see Monica again, never hold her, never hear her voice. Think about Brittany Puryear, the young woman whose death inspired the law that helped convict Monica's killer. Think about all the victims of domestic violence, known and unknown, whose stories we'll never hear. And think about the warning signs that were there throughout Monica's relationship with Brian. The age difference when they met, the lies he told her, the escalating violence, the control, the stalking, the choking, the protective orders that didn't protect her enough. Think about how many people saw the bruises, heard the stories, witnessed the abuse, and yet Monica still ended up dead. Domestic violence thrives in silence. It grows in the shadows. It feeds on isolation. Monica's case reminds us of the importance of believing victims, of taking threats seriously, of providing resources and support to those trying to escape abusive relationships. Brian Sless will spend the rest of his life in prison. Jarlyn Sless faced consequences for her role in the cover-up, but Monica Moynihan is still missing. Her body is somewhere out there, waiting to be found, waiting to be brought home. Her daughters are growing up without their mother. They'll never remember her voice, her laugh, the way she held them. They'll only know her through photographs and stories told by family members who loved her. Monica was 22 years old when she died. She had her whole life ahead of her. She wanted to help bring new life into the world. Instead, her own life was stolen by someone who claimed to love her. Let her story be a reminder. Let it be a call to action. If you see the signs of domestic violence in your own life or in the life of someone you care about, reach out, get help, make a plan, leave safely. You are not alone. And if you know someone who is trapped in an abusive relationship, believe them, support them, help them find resources. Don't judge them for staying or for going back. Understand that leaving is the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence, when violence is most likely to escalate to murder. Monica Moynihan's life mattered. Her dreams mattered. Her children mattered. And her story, tragic as it is, matters too. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.